Hello, and once again welcome to a new series of films for this year. A big thank you once again for all your positive comments and support, and a huge thank you to all those who've subscribed to the channel. This time I've been asked to explore the North Yorkshire Coast, inspired by the series I did back in 2020. I did live in this area back in the late 1970s, so I do have some connection to the area. I'll be travelling from the north to the south along the coast through Cleveland, which of course used to be part of North Yorkshire, and down as far as the border with Humberside, finishing in the seaside resort of Filey. It's a stunning coastline with golden sandy beaches, dramatic cliffs and quaint fishing ports, as well as busy seaside resorts. So sit back and enjoy this journey with me. We begin our journey here in Redcar. In recent times it was famous for its heavy industries like iron and steel and the huge ICI petrochemical plants. Today a lot of that industry has gone for one reason or another. And as you can see there behind me, there's a wind farm out in the bay. But Redcar wasn't always like that. Redcar is situated on a low-lying site next to the sea. The clue to its origins lie in its name. Kjar, which is a Viking word for marsh, and the Old English word reed, therefore Reed Kjar. The town began as a fishing hamlet in the 1300s, trading with its larger neighbour of Cotham. That pretty much remained the case until the mid-1800s. A few miles away lies the town of Stockton, which of course became the starting point for Stephenson's steam railway in 1825 between Stockton and Darlington, the first in the world to carry passengers. By 1846 the railways had grown and developed, and an extension of the line was built to Redcar, promoting the Victorian idea that sea air was good for health. And so Redcar suddenly boomed as a Victorian seaside resort from relative obscurity. The mouth of the River Tees lies just to the north of Redcar, and that provided a port for the export of coal, iron and steel and much more. Many ships were wrecked over the centuries trying to navigate their way into that port. Like many towns along the northeast coast, Redcar was given a lifeboat in 1802. It is the oldest surviving lifeboat in the world, and named after the Marquess of Zetland, the local lord of the manor. The lifeboat is on display in the museum here in Redcar, usually open most days. In 2006, Redcar was dressed as a Dunkirk beach for the film Atonement, starring Keira Knightley and James McAvoy. Today it continues to be popular with holidaymakers and day trippers, and has some wonderful shops, parks, and a fantastic beach for all to enjoy. I would never be forgiven by the people of Cleveland for not including this seaside town in our journey. It's Marske by the Sea. Tourists from outside the region often pronounce it as Marske by the Sea, but to the locals it's Marske. It's widely thought that prehistoric settlements were present all along this coast, though little evidence exists to prove that. We know the Romans were here as they built signal towers all along the coast to warn of Viking invasions. And as we've just heard, Redcar was named by the Vikings, so that brings us at least to the 10th century. Marske is first documented by Bishop Egelric in 1042, who consecrated St Germain's Church, which once stood here. Today the tower has been left, but you can see where the church was. Then it's mentioned in the Domesday Book, which of course was a survey of all towns and properties in England and Wales, ordered by William the Conqueror. And that was in 1086. I guess you could liken it to a modern day census. Marske is mentioned again in 1180, when the village was fined £20 for ransacking a Norwegian ship, which probably ran aground here. Like Redcar, Marske existed as a fishing hamlet in the Middle Ages until it prospered in the Victorian era with the extension of the Stockton to Darlington Railway. Landmarks here include Marske Hall, originally built in 1625 for the Zetland family, who we will hear more about at our next stop. The hall was gifted to the Leonard Cheshire charity as a disabled rehabilitation establishment in 1964, until it was sold to a private owner in 2019. Cliff House overlooks the bay and belonged to a Joseph Pease, very important character that we'll be talking about again on this journey. He was the principal shareholder of the Stockton and Darlington Railway Company and played a major part in the development of this whole area. During the First World War, Mask lay claim to having the Bristol M1C monoplane, nicknamed the Red Devil, based here at Mask Aerodrome. It was the only single-winged fighter put into mass production during World War I. The author of the Biggles books, Captain W.E. Johns, served at the aerodrome, and his stories were imagined here. The aerodrome is no longer here, but the runways are still visible from the air. Apart from the lovely beach, a tourist attraction here is Winky's Castle. Obviously not a castle, but dates back to the 1600s. It was formerly owned by the local shoemaker Jack Anderson, and the cottage was named after Jack's cat Winky. It is now a local museum run by volunteers with over 6,000 items on rotational display. It's not open today, but an exciting development from the museum is the release of a new book of photographs called Then and Now, and a comparison to pictures taken today to how it was in its heyday in the Victorian period. So look out for that when you come to visit. Okay, I'm now going to introduce you to two ladies who are responsible for the Scarecrow Festival.
Hello, I'm Anne. This year I've been helping to organise the Scarecrow Festival, which was originally started by
Barbara Lambert. And I've lived in this area for quite a long time, 40 odd years on and off, and been on the Mask Community Partnership, which is an organisation that we started about 1999, I believe, and we've been trying to arrange events that interest the public for a long time, and eventually we ran out of ideas, except I've always been into puppetry and figure making. The advantage of these festivals is that it's a family thing, and it involves a terrific number of age groups, and also the creative spirit arises with everybody. They suddenly think, oh, I can do that. So we think of a topic. This year it was obviously royal for the Platinum Jubilee of Queen Elizabeth II, so that wasn't too difficult to organise. I think we encouraged the shops to take part the first year by putting scarecrows out that represented their trade or business, and that was very successful. And they realised that it increased the footfall about 100%, and so they were on board from day one.
And here we are again, yes.
There are no clear records to show the origins of Saltburn, but again we know of the prehistoric Roman and Viking presence here. In recent history it began as an inn and a row of fishermen's cottages, which you can see behind me, and it was known as Saltburn Gill. It was well known as a centre for smugglers, and the publican at the inn, John Andrew, was referred to as the king of the smugglers. Saltburn, along with Redcar, Mask and all the towns in this region, were formerly part of the North Riding in the county of York, which was owned by the Dundas family, a very wealthy family owning much of Scotland as well. They began as barons and then progressed to earls and gained the title Earls of Zetland. The name is an ancient derivative of Shetland. They eventually became the Marquesses of Zetland by 1892. The Dundas family were also Lord Lieutenants of Ireland, Orkney and Shetland. Saltburn Gill became Saltburn by the Sea in the Victorian era with the coming of the railway. The land here was purchased from the Earl of Zetland in the 1860s by a Henry Pease, the son of Joseph and the principal shareholder in the Stockton and Darlington Railway. He envisaged a new seaside town served by the railway and wanted the valley containing Skelton Beck turned into ornamental gardens. Saltburn by Sea quickly became a very popular Victorian seaside resort, with a pier built in 1869 and a water-powered funicular cliff lift opened in 1884. It still runs today and is one of the world's oldest water-powered lifts. Where this bandstand is situated today, there was once a bridge spanning 650 feet across the glen from west to east. It consisted of 7 cast iron trestles of varying heights supporting lattice girders, with a roadway and a footpath across the top. It was constructed to connect some expensive villas on one side of the valley with the town centre. It was built in 1868 and the charge for a pedestrian crossing was 1 old halfpenny. So it's hardly surprising then that it got the nickname of the Halfpenny Bridge. It was demolished on the 17th of December 1974 as it was in a dangerous condition, and as I say, the bandstand that is here now is on the site of where that bridge was. Saltburn remains a popular seaside resort with a busy seafront and pier, bespoke shops, delicatessens, hotels and eating places, and so much more. If you're coming for a day trip or a longer stay, you will find plenty to do here. This seemingly inconspicuous settlement has a very, very important history. Its name is Skinningrove, and the word comes from the Old Norse, Skinnara Griffia, Skinner's Grove or ravine, referring to the leather tanning industry that existed here in the 9th century. The area's history goes back much further, to at least 5000 BC, when a Bronze Age settlement existed here. As early as 800 BC, iron was discovered in the area around here, and of course it then became an Iron Age settlement. From 100 to 420 AD, it was the Romans who were here, and they had a signal tower up on the headland over there. When they left, it was occupied by the Angles from the area we now know as Denmark and northern Germany, and that formed the part of the kingdom of Deira as it was known then, and of course that later became the kingdom of Northumbria. In the 9th century it was occupied by the Vikings under Danelaw, and that's when the village acquired its name Skinnara Griffia, or Skinningrove as it is today. The 11th century saw the arrival of the Normans, but the settlement here remained reliant on farming and fishing throughout the Middle Ages until the late 1500s, when the deposits of alum were discovered under the Cleveland Hills. Alum is a colourless crystal and a mixture of two sulfates, aluminium and either potassium or ammonium. It was Thomas Challoner who, on a visit to Italy in the late 1500s, saw how the alum ore was used to cure leather and fix dyes on cloth. We will find out more about its importance as we visit other locations on our journey down the coast. In the 16th century, the mineral was quarried at the surface, whereas today it is mined. The mine at Boulby, which is close by, is still mining the ore today and is the deepest mineral mine in Britain, currently at a depth of 1,400 metres, and the workings stretch right out under the North Sea. And in case you're wondering, Thomas Challoner was a rich landowner in nearby Gisborough, and he noticed that the alum underneath his property was the same as that in Italy. So that's where the connection is. In 1848, an ironstone mine was opened in nearby Loftus. Then, after the railways arrived in the 1860s, the iron-rich Cleveland Hills could be exploited, and Skinningrove was at the epicentre of that. To begin with, the ironstone was put into barges and sailed north to Middlesbrough before being transported onward by rail to ironworks in Durham. Henry Pease bought the mine in the late 1860s and extended the rail network to Skinning Grove. By the late 1800s, the export of iron had expanded and supplies were feeding the steelworks in Grangemouth in Scotland. Transport by rail was beginning to become expensive, and so a substantial jetty was built. You can see the remains of it there behind me, replacing an earlier, more flimsy wooden jetty, so the ore could be loaded onto boats for transportation to Grangemouth. The boats could only be loaded at high tide because of the very shallow bay here, and so loading was done at a furious pace. By the early 20th century, Skinning Grove had its own steelworks, along with those on Teesside, and so the export of ironstone ceased and the jetty fell into decline. In World War II, engineers tried to blow up the jetty to prevent an enemy invasion landing here, but failed to destroy it as it was built so robustly. The late 20th century saw the closure of the mines and the sad decline of the village. Today, its residents commute to nearby Gisborough, Boulby and Redcar for work. In the year 2000, Skinning Grove was flooded twice, both in July and November of that year. Continual heavy rainfall had caused Kilton and Whitecliff becks to overflow into Skinning Grove Beck. If you're not familiar with the local dialect, a beck in Yorkshire is the word for a small river or rivulet. Debris and fallen trees had blocked the bridge, causing the water to build up behind and flood the entire village. More than 100 homes were affected and the villagers had to be evacuated. The Environment Agency has since installed these defensive water gates. And the environment wardens patrol whenever the weather looks dangerous. The village has a mining museum showing its proud history. At present, though, it is undergoing an expansion which looks quite extensive and impressive. So it's not open to the public here now while I'm here filming. So I suggest you check their website for its reopening schedule. The Cleveland Way passes through here, bringing walkers from far and wide, but by far the best attribute Skinning Grove has is Catesty Sands. And if I just move over here, there's a small gap in that jetty, and it's a bit like walking through the wardrobe door into Narnia, because here you can still see the remnants of the industry, but you walk through that little gap and you'll see how magnificent the beach is on the other side. There's a small free car park which you can just see over there on the other side of the river, and a short walk from that car park you get to the gap through the jetty that brings you to this amazing beach. There's no ice cream parlours or donkey rides, but miles of golden sand and clear blue sea. So if you're looking for an inexpensive day out, this is your answer. Just remember to bring your flask. Welcome to another episode in this series looking at the North Yorkshire coastline. Today we'll be continuing a bit further south to see what new points of interest we can discover. From Saltburn right along this coastline to Scarborough and beyond are some of the highest and most dramatic cliffs in England. Nestled at the foot of these cliffs at the mouth of Staithes Beck are the twin villages of Staithes on the south side and Cowbar on the north side. The name Staithes comes from the Anglo-Saxon meaning landing place, suggesting that the reason for its existence relies entirely on the natural harbour here. Two things to note when visiting here regarding the dialect are that the locals call this steers, not staithes, and a beck is a Yorkshire word for a small river. The history of the village goes back at least to the Vikings and probably before that. However, it didn't really develop until the 1400s when it served as a port for surrounding settlements. By the 1500s, it had developed its own fishing fleet of over 50 vessels and had a very busy shellfish industry. By the 19th century, it was the largest fishing port north of the Wash in Lincolnshire. This Yorkshire coast from the Humber and in fact all the way up to Scotland is well known for its unique style of fishing boat called a coble. It is unique in the fact that it is flat bottomed, enabling it to be launched and landed on shallow beaches such as this, but also having a high bow to withstand large waves and breakers during the launch. But also in rough seas, of course. It is thought that their design idea is a combination of the high bow of the Viking longboat and the flat bottom of the Dutch barges that regularly visited this coastline. Staithes also became a busy port for the export of alum from neighbouring settlements, which was used as a fixing agent in the dyeing of cloth, as we've already heard. In 1745, a very young James Cook came to stay in Staithes as an apprentice to a grocer named William Sanderson. This was the grocer's shop, now turned into a cottage. Cook fell in love with the sea while at Staithes and desperately wanted to be a sailor. Sanderson introduced Cook to his friend John Walker, a ship owner in nearby Whitby, and he agreed to take Cook on as a ship apprentice. Of course, I'm talking about the same James Cook that went on to be a captain in the Royal Navy and discover parts of Australia, New Zealand and Hawaii, to name but a few of his achievements. A sinister chapter in Staithes' history came in the late 1700s and early 1800s when the press gangs operated all along the northeast coast, kidnapping able seamen to serve in the Navy in the Napoleonic Wars. The men of the northeast were targeted because of their maritime skill and experience, and very few of them returned home afterwards. The village today is scattered with picturesque craft and coffee shops. There's a heritage museum housed in the old Methodist church, and it has extremely good inns and guest houses. It also boasts the narrowest street in England, measuring only 460 millimetres wide, called the Dog Loop. This is Port Mulgrave, and up until 5 or 10 years ago there was actually a proper path with steps down to the harbour, but there was a landslide and most of that path disappeared and it hasn't been replaced. I don't know whether you can see, but they've provided a rope here to literally climb down that slope, which I'm not even going to attempt with the camera equipment. So what I need to explain to you, I can do from here. Port Mulgrave was originally known as Rosedale. However, when an ironstone mine opened at Rosedale near Kirby Moorside, its name was changed to save confusion to Port Mulgrave, after the local landowner here, the Earl of Mulgrave. Port Mulgrave owes its fame to Sir Charles Palmer, who opened an ironstone mine here and developed it as a small port. Palmer was an entrepreneur and built several shipyards along the Tyne to address the need for coal export from the northeast to London. He also developed a steam-powered collier to succeed the wind-powered sail barges that had been used from the 1300s. With his success and wealth, he bought the land at Port Mulgrave in 1850, and at that time there was a small wooden jetty. The ironstone was loaded onto small barges and moved in and out by paddle steamers. By 1856, Palmer built a harbour to make export more efficient. The ironstone was taken to Palmer's own shipyards and ironworks in Jarrow on the River Tyne. By the 1870s, the iron at Port Mulgrave had run out, so Palmer opened a new mine at Grinkle, about 3 miles away. To get the iron to the harbour, Palmer built a narrow gauge railway which traversed over streams and valleys, and then at the top of the cliffs the wagons were lowered on a tramway through a tunnel by cable to the harbour. The tramway was operated by a stationary steam engine housed at the top of the incline, and a gantry was built so the wagons could be unloaded directly into bunkers on the harbour wall and then into the waiting ships. By 1916, the Redcar and Middlesbrough Railway connected the mine at Grinkle with Teesside and Whitby, and the use of the port declined. By 1920, cheaper foreign iron saw Port Mulgrave decline further until 1934, when it was abandoned altogether. During World War II, the fear of Nazi invasion saw the harbour destroyed by the Royal Engineers. The Cleveland Way brings tourists through here, which of course is a national trail running 110 miles through Cleveland and North Yorkshire, and it tracks its way along the cliff that you can see there behind me. So you get some magnificent views of the coastline. These cliffs are some of the highest in Britain. There are 3 villages which are very similar along this section of coastline. Staithes, which we visited earlier in this episode, Robin Hood's Bay, which we will visit in the next episode, and here in Runswick Bay. They all began as fishermen's cottages, built in a ravine from local stone and terraced together, hugging the cliffside, as you can see there behind me. They all shared a heyday when the alum and ironstone industries provided the economy here to boom, but all have shared the same fate too in recent years. With the closure of the mines and the iron and steel works, the village's population began to disperse over the years in search of employment elsewhere, leaving many properties empty. Fishing only sustained a few families, and so, as with many seaside locations, not just here in North Yorkshire but all around the British Isles, they became ghost towns. In recent times, most of these idyllic cottages have become the perfect holiday homes or second homes for those wealthy enough to afford them. And believe me, the prices are high here, and only occupied during the holiday periods. I've been reliably informed by the local people here that more than 50% of the homes here are not permanently lived in. And in fact, here in Runswick, there are only 6 families remaining as full-time residents. The prices these properties sell for is often way above that which is affordable by ordinary local people. And of course, this has a direct effect on the prosperity of these locations that are now totally reliant on seasonal tourism for their income. Winters are tough here. Having said all that, Runswick Bay is an idyllic village nestling at the foot of some even more dramatic cliffs. And if you look at it there behind me, it's absolutely chocolate box perfect. However, it wasn't always located where it is today. Back in 1682, it was a fishing village situated just a few hundred metres further north on that headland, until a natural disaster struck. The villagers were all attending a funeral wake for a deceased neighbour when a landslide of the soft Jurassic shale completely destroyed the village. Legend says only the dead man's house survived. Thankfully, no one was killed or injured. Brunswick had its own lifeboat from 1866 until it was relocated in 1978 at Staithes, where it was easier and quicker to launch. However, in 1982, the local people organised their own volunteer rescue service using the original lifeboat house. Further disaster befell the village in 1901, when a huge storm caught all the men of the village at sea. The women of the village had to launch the lifeboat to rescue them. Many caves occur naturally along the cliffs here due to coastal erosion. And it is legend here that these were thought to be occupied by bogles or boggarts. In folklore, these can be mischievous goblins, but here at Brunswick they were thought to have healing powers. The caves were called hob holes, and the parents of sick children would be brought to the cave entrance. A fire would be lit, and the parents would sing or chant a plea for the child to be made well. The section of coastline from Staithes all the way south to Flamborough in East Yorkshire is known as the Dinosaur Coast or the Fossil Coast, which is why this coastline is often compared to Devon. The geology of the coast here belongs in the Jurassic period, which formed between 145 million and 200 million years ago. It was the period in which the dinosaurs became extinct and many aquatic species disappeared also. The world climate was at least 5 degrees centigrade hotter than it is now, with 4 times the atmospheric carbon we have now. Forests grew at the poles. The seas were at least 8 degrees centigrade warmer than today, with huge coral reefs. Plant, animal and sea life were all different to today, though many species alive today began their evolution in this period. Britain during that period was covered by shallow, warm seas teeming with life, amphibians, marine reptiles, mollusks and fish. The shale that forms the large part of the cliffs here would have been mud or sediment on the floor of that sea, which is why every now and then, when there is a landslide here, it reveals more undiscovered fossil secrets. If you want to hunt fossils without the crowds, then come in the autumn, winter months. Summer months sees people flocking here for the beach, the quaint coffee shop and the inn, not to mention the many who pass through here along the Cleveland Way. Kettleness gets its name from two Viking words, kettle, referring to the bowl-shaped bay here, and ness, meaning headland. That immediately tells you there have been settlements here from the 800s, and almost certainly a long time before that, probably going back to the Bronze and Iron Ages. The original village here was much larger and situated on the headland. It had an alum works, ironstone works and a jet mining industry. Jet is regarded as a gemstone and formed from compressed coal. It is found along this coast, especially at Whitby, a little further to the south from here. The ironstone was quarried from the cliffs and the beach and loaded onto small boats. In 1829, the entire village on the headland collapsed into the sea, exactly the same as happened with Runswick Bay, and probably due to the extraction of ironstone making the cliffs unstable. The residents had plenty of warning and were evacuated safely without injury or loss of life. The new Kettleness, which you can see there behind me, was built slightly further inland and connected to Whitby and Middlesbrough by the railway, which opened in 1883. It closed in 1958 due to high maintenance costs of the bridges and tunnels and viaducts. The station building still exists, as you can see, and it is used by the Scouts as an outward bound centre. Kettleness had an airfield used in the First World War as a refuelling stop for reconnaissance aircraft operating along the east coast. Legends and folklore claim that there exists a black monstrous dog which haunts the area called a barghest or barghest. Bram Stoker used this idea for his gothic horror novel Dracula. According to the stories, in the 1950s, a vicar confronted the beast and splashed it with holy water to banish it. Apart from fossil hunting, the other attraction at Kettleness Beach is the waterfall, which cascades spectacularly from the cliff face. As I pointed out at our last stop, unsuspecting tourists often get caught out by the incoming tides here. The high crumbling cliffs make it impossible to get off the beaches once you've wandered away from the main access points. Kettleness is accessible from Runswick Bay to the north, as you can see here, but make sure you don't wander too far and that you can get back safely before the tide cuts you off. One of the routes down to the beach at Kettleness is down a steep slope with the aid of a rope, if you are the adventurous sort. Welcome to another episode in this series looking at the North Yorkshire coastline, and I'm joined by an extremely noisy duck today. Today we will be continuing a bit further south to see what new points of interest we can discover. And there's my friend the duck. The name Sands End is due to the location of this village being at the north end of the beach, stretching from Whitby Harbour at the south end. The first settlements here were due to the discovery and development of the alum industry nearby. Thomas Challoner, who we've already heard about in this series, was the local landowner here, and he opened the first quarry for the extraction of alum on the headland here about 1630. When the Middlesbrough to Whitby Railway was built in 1883, a station was built on the cliff top above Sands End, and of course with that came the Victorian tourists. Not all Victorians wanted the hustle and bustle of the busy town in Whitby and sought the peaceful position here at Sands End. The railway line closed in 1958, but tourists still come today, only by car instead. The beach still the main attraction. The station today is a private residence and part of the Mulgrave estate. The station at Sands End was the location for a scene in the 1947 film Holiday Camp, starring the late Dame Flora Robson and Jack Warner, and the first film of many to feature the Huggett family, very popular in post-war Britain's cinemas. A little geological information for you now. The landmass of the United Kingdom is very slowly tipping, with the east coast dipping and the west coast rising. Not a lot, only about 1 centimetre per year, but year on year it causes the sea level to rise here on the east coast as a result. That, coupled with climate change, causes frequent high tides to flood the lower parts of this village. When I lived in this area, this whole area here around the river was often closed due to flooding or storm damage. This is the Fish Cottage, one of the businesses here in Sands End. It was originally a fisherman's cottage, hence its name. Beautiful little restaurant, serves every kind of seafood and pretty much open 24/7. Well worth a visit on your visit to Sands End. The earliest record of a settlement here in Whitby is in 656 AD, when it was called Strains Heath. At that time, Whitby was part of the ancient kingdom of Deira, ruled by Ethelfrith. Oswig, his second son, took over the throne in 642 AD and merged the lands of Bernicia and Deira to form Northumbria. He established a monastery at Whitby in which St. Hilda was the abbess. She was an important figure in the Christianisation of Saxon England, and many of England's kings sought her advice. In 867 AD, the pesky Vikings raided these shores and destroyed the monastery, and they gave Whitby its present name, which in Old Norse means white settlement. In 1078, after the Norman invasion, the land around Whitby was given to William de Percy, and in turn he donated the area around Whitby for a Benedictine abbey to be built. A natural harbour is formed by the estuary of the River Esk, which flows out to sea at Whitby. Wooden jetties served as landing places for European traders keen to do business with the abbey. Because of the steep hills surrounding Whitby, the harbour was known as the only viable road into town. Wine was the biggest import, and salted herring was the main export. The abbey was the source of revenue and wealth for Whitby until 1540, when Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries reduced it to ruins. The abbey ruins dominate the southern headland, as it still does today, and it featured in the Bram Stoker's novel Dracula, which he wrote in 1897. The abbey featured in both films made from the book, the first in 1979 and the second in 1992. During the filming of the 1979 version, lots of strange events took place, such as actors and crew falling mysteriously ill, and whole reels of film wiped mysteriously blank. The ruins certainly have an unnerving feel if you care to walk around them, and the site is owned by English Heritage. In 1392, the first records show coal coming into Whitby from nearby Sunderland. This import would prove invaluable later in the 1600s for processing alum. Up until 1540, Whitby only had 200 residents, governed by the abbey. After the dissolution, the local burgess applied for self-governance, though this was not granted until 1550. During the reign of Elizabeth I, Whitby grew into a small fishing port. Then in the late 1500s, Thomas Challoner, who we've heard of in previous episodes, the local landowner of the Gisborough Estates, not far to the north of here, he witnessed the properties of alum on a visit to Italy. He saw the rock being processed and used in medicine, the curing of leather, and its use as a fixing agent in the dyeing of cloth. Under Elizabeth I's reign, the economy of Tudor England at this time relied on wool and linen. The Tudor court and the upper classes wanted to wear clothes with bright, rich colours, and in that period the dyes were derived from natural plant sources, and these were not colour fast during washing. Alum was the solution to the problem, as it acts as a fixing agent. At that time, Italy was the main source of alum, and all exports were under the strict rule of the Pope during medieval times. With Henry VIII being out of favour due to his divorce of Catherine of Aragon, the Pope limited the export of alum to England, a sort of a sanction. So the discovery of vast deposits of alum under Challoner's land was very good news indeed. Whitby, having the best access to the sea, became the main port for its export throughout England, and it was alum exports that really made Whitby's future. Remember, cargo was transported by sea in those days, as roadways were not metalled and littered with highway robbers. As the alum industry grew, Whitby needed bigger ships, and so shipyards sprang up all along the west banks of the river, and by 1790 was rivalled only by Newcastle for the building of merchant ships. Around 1753, Whitby began producing whaling ships, which fished off the coast of Greenland. When the trade ceased in the 1830s, a total of 2,761 whales, 25,000 seals and 55 polar bears had been caught and landed at Whitby. The West Cliffs have the huge jawbones of a whale landed here as a monument to the days of successful whaling. Next to the jawbones is the monument to Captain James Cook, who we mentioned when we visited Staithes. A replica of Cook's ship, the Endeavour, is moored in the harbour here as a tourist attraction. He was at sea for 3 years on his trip of discovery across the Pacific. Explorers had talked about a landmass in the Southern Ocean for years, but no one knew for certain until Cook's voyage. He put Tahiti, Australia and New Zealand on the map for sure. He's perhaps the most famous person to have originated from here, and many of the streets in the towns and villages all the way back to Redcar have Captain Cook in their name somewhere. The late 1800s saw the development of iron ships and the port facilities in Teesside, so the smaller Yorkshire ports like this one lost their importance and started to decline. The fishing fleet remains strong in Whitby though, even to today. In 1839, a new railway emerged between York, Pickering and here in Whitby, so the town had a new source of trade with tourism. The tourists came in search of the spa waters here, which come from 3 natural springs enriched with iron salts. Tourists also came in search of jet, which we've mentioned in previous episodes. So what is jet? Well, it's where the term jet black comes from, due to its pure black appearance. Most geologists agree it is formed from the fossilised remains of the Araucaria tree. The vast forests of these trees covered large parts of Britain in the Jurassic period, which was about 180 million years ago. Over millions of years, these fossilised forests became compressed by overlying sand and sediment deposited on the seabed, which then covered the area in the eras which followed. When fossilised wood becomes compressed, it forms coal. Now, I'm not saying jet is coal, not at all, but it is formed when the coal seams formed by these fossilised Araucaria trees become superheated and compressed by the overlying rocks. Jet is found in other areas of the world, but jet here in Whitby is the purest in the world. As we discussed in the last episode at Kettleness, jet has been quarried for many hundreds of years, in fact thousands of years, right back to the Bronze Age. Jet didn't really become fashionable though till the Georgian period, when George IV declared it the official gemstone to be worn for funerals and when in mourning. The semi-precious gemstones of jet were very sought after during the Georgian period, but more so in the following Victorian period, being a particular favourite with Queen Victoria. She wore a Whitby jet brooch after Albert's death, and in fact many pictures show her wearing Whitby jet jewellery. The endorsement of the monarch sealed the fame of this unique and rare stone. A number of bridges have existed over the years, linking the east and west banks of the River Esk, and all were toll bridges with means of lifting or revolving the roadway to allow ships to pass into the inner harbour, which you can see there behind me. The swing bridge here today was installed in 1909 and is operated electronically. Whitby has countless shops selling jet jewellery, fossils and everything else from fashion to sweets, ice cream and rock. If you watched the recent episode of the BBC's Country File, which did a piece here in Whitby, you will have seen the famous Botham's Bakery. The bakery began in 1865 and was set up by a remarkable lady, Elizabeth Botham, who was the mother of 10 children, no less. She established the bakery purely to feed her family, but her recipes are still made and sold here in Whitby by her descendants. The business still runs in the Botham family. The most famous of her recipes are her lemon buns, made to a secret recipe closely guarded by the family. You can't say that you've been to Whitby until you've had one. I couldn't visit Whitby and not mention its famous lifeboat. As I've mentioned several times throughout this series, the RNLI's lifeboats have played a major part in the history of this dramatic coast. Today, Whitby has 2 lifeboats, a D-class inflatable inshore boat suited to rescues close to shore and especially at the foot of the perilous cliffs here, bearing in mind what I said about incoming tides and people constantly getting stranded and trapped. It also has a Trent class all-weather boat with a top speed of 25 knots and designed to operate in deep water over a range of 250 miles. In 1947, Whitby acquired the Robert and Ellen Robson lifeboat, which is a 34-foot Ruby-designed Dungeness class self-righting boat and propelled by 8 oarsmen. It began service with the RNLI at Tramore on the south coast of Ireland in 1918 and was then transferred to Aberdeen in 1924. The boat served in Whitby between 1947 and 1957 and was noted for being the last rowing lifeboat to be in active service. It is now housed in the Lifeboat Museum on Pier Road, and although the museum is closed at present for renovation, it is due to open in late spring of this year. There are many excellent guest houses and hotels, numerous coffee shops and eating places, and the seafood served here is fresh off the Whitby boats. After you've had your lemon bun, a visit to Whitby would not be complete without walking up the 199 steps to St Mary's Church and the Abbey, or the Abbey ruins, I should say, which sits just behind that church, and you can frighten yourself to death in there. And then ending the day with the original English fast food, a hearty meal of fish and chips. Well, I've walked the 199 steps. I've been to Botham's and got me iced bun, me lemon bun, and you have to eat it the Whitby way, so you break the bun in half and fold it over. Superb. An absolute must. We're here at Robin Hood's Bay, just down the bank there behind me, and we'll be going down there in a minute or two to have a closer look around. It's 6 miles south of Whitby, and it lies in a fissure between two very steep cliffs. Its name seems to have come from the legendary Nottingham figure, as he and Little John were meant to have saved the village from an attack by French pirates. Even if Robin Hood existed, it seems highly unlikely he would be this far north, but who knows? The facts we do know for certain are that from 800 AD, this area was in the hands of the Vikings under Danelaw. I've talked about Danelaw previously, so what is it? Or should I say, what was it? During the early Celtic Britons, there were no set laws or recognised rules to society, and there are no records of any imperial laws left by the Romans either. The first laws in England were introduced by the Saxons when they invaded Britain in 450 AD. It was derived from ancient Germanic laws and called West Saxon law. The Danes first invaded England in 793 AD, landing on Lindisfarne Island, wiping out all who lived there. As soon as they became established on the mainland and they took more and more land, they established their own laws called Danelaw. It was only after the Norman invasion of 1066 that English law became unified under William the Conqueror. The whole area around Robin Hood's Bay was laid to waste, and William the Conqueror gave the area to a Norman nobleman who sold it on to the Abbey at Whitby. In 1324, Robin Hood's Bay was mentioned in a letter to Edward III, complaining that the locals were confiscating the boats and catches of the French fishermen and taking them to Robin Hood's Bay. There is no record of whether Edward acted on this letter. After the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII in 1540, the area became the property of the Crown. The village has a tradition of smuggling, and the houses here all had a network of interconnecting tunnels, enabling contraband to be moved undetected. Smuggling was rife on the Yorkshire coast during the 1700s. Tea, gin, rum, brandy and tobacco were all smuggled in from Holland and France. They were distributed by syndicates based inland so as not to implicate the villagers. The legitimate occupation here was of course fishing, and once again cobles were the vessels used. In the late 1800s the fishing industry began to decline, but was succeeded by tourism as the railways were developed. A dramatic rescue was carried out here in 1881 when a brig, which was a small merchant vessel, ran aground during a violent storm. The sea was so rough the Whitby lifeboat could not be launched, and so it was dragged by 18 horses 6 miles overland through 7-foot snowdrifts. 200 men assisted the journey, clearing snowdrifts as they went, and then as the boat was manoeuvred through the narrow streets, they demolished garden walls and dug up bushes to get the lifeboat through. On the second attempt, they got the lifeboat launched and the crew were saved. Robin Hood's Bay has featured in several novels, including Bram Stoker's Dracula. The 2008 film Wild Child had several scenes filmed here too. A famous resident of Robin Hood's Bay was a chap called Leo Walmsley. He was the son of James Ulrich Walmsley, a gifted painter born in Liverpool in 1860. Ulrich was trained as an architect in Ireland before going to study fine art under Stanhope Forbes in Newlyn in Cornwall. Forbes was Irish born and established an art school / society in Newlyn in Cornwall. Ulrich moved back to Yorkshire when he was 34. Leo, or Lionel, was born in Shipley in West Yorkshire in 1892. And then in 1894 the family moved to Robin Hood's Bay. As a boy, Leo attended the Wesleyan School in Robin Hood's Bay, and then at the age of 18 became the curator of the Marine Laboratory, which was situated here. And he earned the princely sum of 5 shillings a week, which was quite good for that day. In World War I, Leo served in the Royal Flying Corps in East Africa and was awarded the Military Cross. It was after the war his literary career began, basing his books on the places and people he knew. The 3 most well-read of his books were based here at Robin Hood's Bay and known as the Bramblewick Trilogy: 3 Fevers, Phantom Lobster and Sally Lunn. These should not be confused with novels bearing the same name, the Bramblewick novels, which were written by Sharon Booth in the last 5 years. Leo moved home more than once after the war before settling in Fowey in Cornwall with his 3rd wife, a lady called Stephanie Gubbins. Leo died in 1966 and a Walmsley Society based in Halifax exists, keeping his work and his father's work accessible to new readers and new viewers. Car parking is situated at the top of the cliffs, and as you can see behind me, it's a steep walk down and then back up, of course. Welcome to another episode in this series looking at the North Yorkshire coastline, and in fact this is the last episode in this series. In this episode we will be completing our journey south along the coast, finishing just north of the border with East Yorkshire in Filey. Today we are a little bit further south from Whitby and Robin Hood's Bay, and literally just on the north edge of a small hamlet called Ravenscar. And this particular site was the Peak Alum Works, started in the 1600s. As we know, the Gisborough aristocrat Thomas Challoner noticed that the shale deposits on his land were similar to the rocks in Italy where alum was extracted. As we discussed in the last episode, alum was much sought after by the aristocracy of the Tudor period. Their extravagant clothes were decorated using natural plant dyes which faded when washed. Alum was discovered to act as a fixative, making the dyes colour fast. When England was refused exports of alum from Rome due to Henry VIII's falling out with the Pope, it meant Challoner's discovery of alum on his land here in Yorkshire was very welcome news. And so he began the development of alum quarries up and down this part of the coastline. The process of extraction was very complicated and took months to complete, but such was the demand for alum at that time, it was worth the effort. Boys as young as 7 dug the shale out of the quarry face and placed it into barrows. It was then tipped onto huge brushwood fires known as clamps. Seaweed was added to provide the potash content. We mentioned in the last episode about coal being brought into Whitby from Sunderland. Well, it was that coal that kept the fires smouldering continuously all year round. As the grey-coloured shale burned, it turned pink, and it was raked out and transferred to leaching pits where it was washed. More fresh shale would be added to the fires to keep the process going. From the leaching process, a liquid aluminium sulfate was produced. Being mildly toxic to handle, it was allowed to flow along channels down to the alum works and mixed with human urine. If you recall from the first episode, alum is a combination of aluminium sulfate with either potassium sulfate or ammonium sulfate. Human urine provided unlimited quantities of ammonium at no cost. The combined liquor was left until alum crystals formed, which could then be harvested for export. Urine was collected from Newcastle and even London. Containers were placed on street corners with members of the public encouraged to use them in order that the urine could be collected in sufficient quantities. As much as 200 tonnes of urine were needed each year to keep the alum works productive. That's a total of 204,000 litres. Apparently a special public toilet was built in Hull specifically to collect urine for alum production here in North Yorkshire. Many ships and boats would come and go every day all along this coast, bringing a cargo of urine in and taking alum and ironstone out. By 1855, alum was being produced synthetically. Around the same period, aniline dyes had been developed in Germany, which contained their own fixative. By 1871, the last alum works in Yorkshire closed as the new process was cheaper and more efficient. Just the ruins of the former works remain today, and if you're doing the Cleveland Way literally comes right through the Peak alum works. Scarborough's origins go all the way back to the Stone Age, and then succeeded by the Bronze and Iron Ages, with settlements built on the headland that you can see there behind me. The Romans had a settlement here around 370 AD, supporting a signal tower similar to that one at Skinningrove. During that period, the Saxons from the Germanic lands in northern Europe were making frequent raids into England along the east coast, and signal torches would be lit in these signal towers to alert the Roman army of the ensuing incursions. After the Romans, the Angles and the Saxons took over, and Scarborough became part of Deira, and then in turn, of course, became part of Northumbria. That is until a Viking called Thorgils Skarthi invaded and took over the entire area. His name provided the first part of the town's name. Scarth became Scar, and the borough bit is a modern derivative of burg, meaning fortified settlement, referring to the site occupied by Scarborough Castle that you can see there behind me. Living under Danelaw, Scarborough continued peacefully until 1066, when it was invaded, not by William the Conqueror, as you might guess, but by the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada, and he was assisted by Tostig Gudmundsson. Tostig Gudmundsson was an Anglo-Saxon earl and the brother of King Harold II. Tostig invited Hardrada to invade England in an attempt to overthrow King Harold. So Hardrada and the Norwegians landed at Scarborough and completely burned the town, killing everybody. Tostig and Hardrada didn't have long to celebrate their success, as both of them were killed along with most of the invaders at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in September of 1066. Of course, King Harold himself was killed and his army defeated only a month later at the Battle of Hastings. Scarborough lay waste for much of the William Conqueror's reign and his successors. until it was revived by Henry II, the first Plantagenet king, in 1154. Henry was a strong king and built the castle keep here in 1158. Soon a small town sprang up around the castle and markets were held for local traders and craftsmen. By the 1200s, Scarborough had developed into a busy market town and port. The major export was Yorkshire wool. In 1253, the town was granted the right to hold an annual fair, which wasn't unusual, except that Scarborough Fair went on for 45 days. And that was from mid-August to the end of September each year. It became the inspiration for Simon and Garfunkel's song in 1966. And before you panic, I won't ruin your viewing by attempting to sing that for you. The 1200s also saw the friars arrive in Scarborough. Whereas monks remained recluse, friars went out into the community preaching and helping the poor. 3 separate communities existed: the Franciscans wearing grey tunics, the Dominicans wearing black, and the Carmelites wearing white. In 1349, Scarborough was hit by the Black Death plague, which almost wiped out the population of 3,000. Scarborough continued to decline with the closing of the friaries after the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII. During the 1600s, Scarborough, and in particular the harbour, was revived and regenerated once again, this time because of the coal trade from Newcastle and Sunderland. As we just heard at our last destination, at that time coal was needed for the alum trade along the North Yorkshire coast, but it was also exported by sea all the way south to London and across to Europe. The coal ships, known as colliers, often docked here in Scarborough on their way south before they crossed the North Sea to Europe, especially in rough seas. In 1626, Mrs. Thomason Farrer discovered a natural spring at the base of the cliffs on the south shore. The water tasted bitter and stained the rocks a reddish brown. She was the wife of John Farrer, the bailiff for Scarborough, and news quickly spread about the healing properties of the water. The water was analysed by medical professionals and found to contain high levels of magnesium sulfate, similar to Andrew's liver salts of today. Very quickly, Scarborough became a spa town, attracting the rich from London and all over Yorkshire long before Bath and Brighton became popular. By the 1700s, doctors were claiming that bathing in seawater was good for health, and Scarborough once again answered the call. Already it was fast developing into Britain's first seaside resort. In 1737, a collapse of the cliff buried the spring and the spa house. Within 2 years, the impressive spa building you see today was built, opened in 1739, and the spa well restored, proving its value to the town. The coming of the railways in 1845 brought a new wave of visitors and tourists during the Victorian era, and Scarborough was cemented as the quintessential seaside getaway destination, but all the while remaining a busy fishing port and harbour. There are lots of attractions here. Don't miss the Georgian Rotunda Museum with its collection of locally found fossils and geological displays. The Scarborough Art Gallery, with its permanent collection of Sir Frederick Leighton's work. Also the Maritime Heritage Centre, and in St Mary's Churchyard is the grave of Anne Bronte. She was the Bronte sister who wrote The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. She had come to Scarborough hoping the spa water would help her recover from tuberculosis, commonly known then as consumption. Alas, it didn't help, and she died at the Grand Hotel, which overlooks the South Bay. Sister Charlotte said she should lay where the flower had fallen, rather than be buried at her home in Haworth. The list of attractions here is endless. Everything you can imagine you might find in a seaside resort, a British seaside resort. Bespoke craft shops, vintage sweet shops, ice cream and candy floss galore, and of course the British iconic fish and chips. Not forgetting the marina and two very splendid beaches. Today we are in Filey, and this place marks the end of our journey along the North Yorkshire coast. From here the route south takes you into East Yorkshire with further iconic seaside locations such as Flamborough, Bridlington and Hornsea, to name but a few. The Yorkshire folk are very proud people, and I would like to take this opportunity to apologise for referring to the area to the south of here as Humberside in the very first episode, when in fact it is East Yorkshire. My mistake and my humble apologies. As with previous locations we visited in this series, the rich resources of the North Yorkshire coast have been exploited by hunter-gatherer communities right back to Paleolithic times, spanning a period from 500,000 years to 10,000 years BC. Evidence such as earthworks, burial mounds, flint tools have all been found proving this. More recent evidence of a settlement in Filey are the remains of a Roman signal tower. This signal tower was one of at least 5 stretching from here in Filey all the way north to Saltburn. This area of the Yorkshire coast, which lies just to the north of York, was very important to the Romans and had many prosperous landowners living in huge villas. The signal towers were built towards the end of the Roman occupation in response to hostile incursions from the north. Heavy rain in 1857 caused a landslip on the cliff at Carnaze, and it revealed a portion of a wall. When some of the stones were removed, an earthen vase, human and animal bones, and some ornamental shells were found. A more rigorous excavation was funded by the landowner, the Reverend Brooke, and this uncovered the 5 stones that now reside in Crescent Gardens. These formed part of that signal tower and were relocated here due to the continued erosion of the cliff at Carnaze. Filey Brig is a very narrow strip of land which actually gets covered at high tide and is only accessible at low tide. From what I can gather, a brig was an ancient Germanic word for a bridge of some sort, not necessarily the kind we associate with spanning a river, but rather bridging a gap. I guess this narrow neck of land could be viewed as forming a land bridge with the mainland. In Mike Hitch's book Filey Through Time, he claims the brig was known as the File and so gave Filey its name. Around 1180, the Benedictine monks at Bridlington, which is just a little bit further south from here, established a church in Filey. The building was finished in 1230 and dedicated to St Oswald, the Celtic king of Northumbria, the king who was responsible for founding Christianity in the north. In the tower of the Grade 1 listed building are over 1,500 examples of medieval graffiti, mapping over 400 years of Filey's history. Unfortunately, the church was closed on my visit, so I wasn't able to get in and film that graffiti. Fishing has been the mainstay of this town for centuries, mostly done by cobles, and the main catch being sea trout, herring and haddock. Filey remained a fishing village right up until the late 1700s, when the tourists from the crowded beaches at Scarborough overspilled into Filey looking for peace and quiet. A wealthy Birmingham solicitor called John Wilkes Unet bought land here in 1835 and built a grand crescent terrace of houses, later known as Royal Crescent. And the crescent I'm talking about is literally right in front of me as I'm speaking to you. During the 1850s, Charlotte Bronte visited Filey several times, seeking recuperation from ill health, similar to her sister Anne's visit to Scarborough. We know Anne died of tuberculosis, which ran right through the Bronte family, and it actually killed most of them. Charlotte Bronte was only 38 when she died, and the last of the Bronte sisters to die. She was newly married and heavily pregnant and suffered severe morning sickness. Although her death certificate reads that she too died of TB, it is now widely thought that she died of a condition called hyperemesis, or HG, through dehydration and malnutrition. Unlike Anne, Charlotte was buried in Haworth with the rest of her family. Another interesting fact here in Filey is that it had its own flying school, and that was 1910 to 1912. The Wright brothers had amazed the world with their heavier-than-air powered flight on the 17th of December 1903 in North Carolina, USA. This sparked a drive to develop this new mode of transport commercially. In Europe, the French then took the lead in developing flight, with Louis Blériot developing his monoplane and successfully navigating the English Channel. Not to be outdone by the French, a retired businessman by the name of Mr. J.W. Tranmere persuaded Filey Borough Council to build an aircraft hangar, and that was at Flat Cliffs. There'd been a new concrete ramp built for boats to access the beach. So this was an ideal way of getting the aeroplanes down onto the sands. And as you can see, the beach is completely flat and extremely wide and long, so perfect for the launching and landing of these aircraft. For one reason or another, Tranmere's flying club struggled to gain funding, and an advert was placed in the Flight magazine in 1911. A guy called Robert Blackburn answered that advert. He was an aircraft engineer from Leeds, had pioneered the Mercury monoplanes, and to recover some of his costs, he saw taking over Filey Flying Club as a way of recouping some of those costs. He took over Filey Flying Club and changed its name to the Blackburn Flying School. Blackburn continued to develop new aircraft and all the while new records. In flight, distances and height were being set by the pilots at Filey. There was even talk of setting up a regular service between Filey and Bridlington to the south, as well as Scarborough to the north. All went swimmingly well till a December afternoon in 1911. One of the flying instructors, a chap called Hubert Oxley, along with Robert Weiss, one of his students, embarked on a flight to Leeds, which he had done several times before. He took off from the beach on a trial circuit, encircling the town and reaching a height of 500 feet. His intention was to land back on the beach before attempting the longer flight to Leeds. The normal method of landing these early planes was to switch off the engine and glide down, but Oxley liked to land with the engine running. As he pointed the aircraft towards the ground, it went into a steep dive at 150 miles per hour. The velocity of the dive ripped both wings from the aircraft, because bear in mind these were very, very flimsy, very, very light wood with stretched canvas over the frames. The wings sheared off and Oxley was thrown out. He fell to the beach, breaking his neck, and died instantly. Wise was stuck in the fuselage, and although he survived the impact with the ground, he died of his injuries an hour later. The town were in shock for a long time, as they were both very popular men in Filey, known by everyone. After that, Blackburn moved the aircraft company, which it had become by then, and moved it to Brough in East Yorkshire. And Robert Blackburn remained in charge, the chairman of that company, until his death in 1955. The aircraft company still exists, but it's now part of BAE Systems. If you want to find out more on this particular episode, then there is plenty of information online, and of course if you visit Filey, there are information boards all over the seafront to give you the finer details of this amazing story. But who would have thought, you know, this sleepy seaside village, and it was the host to the early pioneers of flight. Amazing. In 1939, the beginning of the Second World War, work began on Butlins holiday camp, which is the thing that most springs to people's mind when you mention Filey. It never was used as a holiday camp on completion, because by then the war was in full swing and it was used by the RAF throughout World War II. At the end of the war, it was handed back to the holiday company, and it was opened for its intended use as a holiday camp. Butlins opened several holiday camps in many English resorts during the late 1940s. The holiday camp in Filey had a massive impact on Filey's economy, taking 10,000 holidaymakers at a time, providing major employment for the town. It even had its own railway station. By 1984, cheap foreign holidays were the mainstay of the British public, and it drove Butlins to close, and so too did the station. Today there's nothing left of the holiday camp. The site is occupied by a caravan park, and the remnants of the station platform, which still does exist, is on private land, so not accessible for filming, unfortunately. That closure resulted in a steep decline in tourists choosing Filey as their holiday destination. It still does get some, mostly retired people looking for somewhere with a bit of peace and quiet, as I say, away from Scarborough, which tends to attract much younger families. But despite that, Filey still has a vibrant seafront with plenty to do, centred around its beach and its coastline. And here behind me is a putting green, a little bit further up is a golf course, lots of fine restaurants and eating places, so still well worth a visit. In 2018, the town was included in the cycling event Tour de Yorkshire, and that was for the first time. 2 miles just to the north of Filey, so if you're coming in from Scarborough, it's literally just before you get into Filey itself. There's a vintage steam museum. Now, the owners were very kind to let me in this morning to film, and so you can see what's available inside. But it is important to note that this is a museum and not an indoor play area. So there is fairground rides, vintage fairground rides, but they're there purely as an exhibit. They're not working or functioning for children. Large collection of vintage vehicles, as well as the steam traction engines and the steam organs and Wurlitzers. Well worth a visit if you're coming to Filey. But as I said, purely a museum, not for an indoor play area. that concludes this episode and this series. I do hope you've enjoyed it and found it entertaining and enjoyable. We've travelled approximately 55 miles as the crow flies from Redcar, where we started, to the conclusion here in Filey. This section of coastline has something for everyone, whether you're a keen walker and want to tackle the Cleveland Way, or a day tripper looking for things of interest. There's something for everyone. The splendour doesn't end here though. Just a few miles further south down there is Flamborough Head, Bridlington, Skipsea and Hornsea, all with their own history and attractions. However, this is a story for another day. I would like to reiterate my message of safety, as I've already expressed several times throughout this series. If you compare this coast with that of the Northumberland coastline, which I filmed in 2020, it is practically all sand dunes along its shores all the way to Berwick on the border with Scotland, making the beaches easily accessible at any point along its entire length. The beaches on this coastline, however, are not as accessible. In fact, quite the opposite. Large parts of the coast are fringed with 600-foot cliffs with no way down or back up. They are even too dangerous for climbers, as the crumbling shale rocks that form the cliffs regularly give way and collapse into the sea. At low tide, you can walk many miles along the beautiful flat sandy beaches from various access points, but many visitors get caught out by the incoming tide and stranded with no way off. You should always be aware of tidal times and make sure you return before being trapped. The inshore lifeboats situated all along this coast work tirelessly in the spring and summer, rescuing people who've become stranded. Also bear in mind there is often no cell phone signal at the foot of these cliffs, so calling for help isn't always possible either. I'm not trying to put you off visiting here. It's an amazing part of the English coast. But I'm just issuing that note of caution. In my view, the best way to see this coast is to embark on the Cleveland Way, which you can do in short, doable sections. The route takes you right along the cliff tops and you get some stunning views. If you're not a walker or your mobility is restricted in some way, then the places I have shown in this series are reasonably accessed by car. As I always say, it takes months to do the research and many hundreds of hours to do the filming and post-production. So please show your support by subscribing to this channel, as this allows more people to see my work and lets me know that you enjoy my films. I always reply to messages, positive ones that is, so please send me a message and give me some comments. And this year I'm particularly asking for requests. So if anybody's got a good idea of what the next production might be, please let me know in the comments underneath. Well, I hope to be with you all again very soon with a new production, but for now, it's goodbye.